Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming and leaving the sun to wait. It will still be there when we're done. Now we're gonna shed some light on a different topic. My name is Andrea, and I'm part of Opt-in for Privacy, together with Miruna and Olga over there. And we decided to organize this panel debate because we were talking about GDPR, and we realized that we have so many different opinions about it, uh, partly because it affects so many different aspects, but also because we come from different backgrounds, so we have different understandings of it. So then we thought, why don't we invite some people that know more about GDPR, which also come from different backgrounds themselves too. General Data Protection Regulation, going into effect May 2018. A lot of stormy weather about it. But what's so special about it? Most of the things are still found in national regulations. We chatted with a lot of people from our network, and they said, yeah, but you still have to give informed consent, you still have to do all of these things. But what makes general data protection regulation so special in the end? And we realize is this great incentive to comply, a great incentive in the shape of some fines that go up to 20 million euros or 4% of global annual revenue, whichever is bigger. And that is pretty much a game changer, because now it's a lot more profitable to actually comply rather ignore this regulation. We thought, okay, so big fines, but what about the user's protection? Is that enough? Are those big fines enough for the actual law to be efficient, implemented? So we are asking this question: are GDPR's fines enough to safeguard EU individuals' right to protection of personal data? And we're hoping to hear today some points about the GDPR efficiency in raising user awareness, blockchain use in public sector and how does it connect to GDPR, the scalability of privacy by design from a business point of view, privacy by design being a central principle of GDPR, but also privacy as perhaps an opportunity to be mishandled into greenwashing, or the difficulties of implementing privacy by design in the banking sector. And our panel members here are 5, and I'll start presenting them. The first one is Tessa. She's Tessa Pavel. She's a board member of IT Politis Forening, final year law student specialized in data protection, who also works with this field in her daily job. Then we have Nils Lindström. He is the GDPR panel manager at Danske Bank. He works with identifying GDPR gaps in the Danske Bank group and implementing related changes. Then we have Pernille, author of Data Ethics as a Competitive Advantage, former journalist and now advisor and speaker on data ethics and digital self-defense. Martin von Haller, he's a IT lawyer, Danish IT lawyer, partner at Bird & Bird, with a specialization in open source and types of open businesses. His current interests are blockchain and DLT. And Irina Shklovsky, associate professor at ITU. She's involved in research projects like technology in practice and interaction design. Her current research focus is the role of communication technology in supporting social networks. And she's now leading the EU project VERT-EU that focuses on ethics enactment in IoT development. We will hear 5-7 minutes of thoughts from each of them, and then we will open the panel for them to interact with each other, and then we will take some questions from the audience too. And the first one, Tessa.
Hello. Is it on? Yeah. Well, Jesper, I'm representing IT Political Association Denmark, which is a Danish NGO working to preserve and sustain privacy and digital rights. And Jesper asked the question if GDPR will make users notice the huge threat that the increasing online surveillance poses to their privacy. And the short answer would be no, because legislation is in itself is not enough to create a long-term awareness among the users. But GDPR definitely will impose a big compliance risk for companies, which will face these big penalties Andrea mentioned. This will play a huge factor in companies now having to work to implement these basic rights into their systems to secure their compliance. The media hype in Denmark is primarily concerned about principles which already existed in the existing legislation. So it's pretty much a storm in a glass of water. But in regard of the private companies, GDPR will ensure that they have to take in mind the users' digital rights when collecting data. Yeah, and that was what I had on Jesper's question.
Thank you. Let's hear some thoughts from Niels.
Is this working right away? It is. Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me here. The question about whether the increased fines will be a motivator for companies to be compliant to GDPR. The short answer is yes. Compared to existing legislation and the inspections that companies like my own company, Danske Bank, has been driven through by authorities, I think, to my knowledge, the highest fine so far issued in Denmark to any company is 25,000 Danish kroners. I think Danske has had one of 20,000 kroners. So if you do a simple cost-benefit calculation and look at the cost that you have to provide in order to be compliant with the existing legislation, then it has been quite a simple calculation. And also the interest from media and customers in general has not been that big on data privacy, actually. So the motivation has not been there until now. When you talk about fines of up to 20 million euros or 4% of an annual turnover, as a company you don't want too many of those fines. Then you actually have to close the company down. And also related to a fine of that size would be, and I know by experience for a company like Danske Bank, it would be a lot of bad press also that would also be very costly for a company. So yes, the motivation is there. Then there was the second teaser or question to me about privacy by design and how difficult it would be for existing huge companies to implement privacy by design in existing systems, in existing functionality and data models, and what are the actual challenges. And I'll talk about that by telling you about two examples that I've been going through over the last year. When we started looking into GDPR, starting last year, January, February, one of the first things that we talked about was the fact that we, as well as a lot of other organizations which IT systems have been built in the late 70s, in the 80s, based on the mainframe. We have, at least here in Denmark, we have, those of you from Denmark know the Danish CPR number. And that CPR number might not be a sensitive piece of information, but it's definitely personal related. That CPR number is used as the key to many databases. I think we have counted in our production environment 12,000 plus databases where the CPR number is the direct key to the data. Now, from a logical perspective, a simple way of getting rid of that problem was to replace the CPR number with a dummy key, and then only have the translation of the CPR number to the dummy key stored in one place where you can restrict the access and all that. So that was a logical, simple way to get rid of that problem. However, looking into the practical world with the CPR number existing in so many databases, and that is only in the production environment, we have the test environments also, the analytics, the data warehouse, using it for reporting for authorities and blah, blah, blah. We put together a little expertise group who analyzed this and came up with two possible solutions of how to translate or replace the CPR number in the database. They were both doable, but the fact was that either one of them would be quite costly. It would be like 100 million Danish kroner plus for both solutions. And also the operational risk of replacing the CPR number, it would be a huge operation. So the operational risk, if you actually think of that we lost some CPR numbers as the key to our tables, I don't think those particular customers would be too happy about that. So the choice was actually not to execute, not to carry it out. Now we know that the CPR number is there, and due to GDPR, we have to make our way around that fact in other ways. The second example is about the right to be forgotten in GDPR, that as a company, you should not keep any personal information on data subjects for a longer period than you actually have a reason for doing so. And what it actually, the challenge that it gives us is that we have to absolutely make sure that every piece of data that we have, that we can document the reason why we have it. I have received an estimate only last Tuesday of that project that we initiated to actually get rid of all the data that we no longer have the right to have, and also to ensure that going forward we have processes and systems that have built in those solutions, so we only keep the data that we actually have a reason to keep. Now that solution, if we want to implement it 100%, is also a 3-digit million Danish kroner project, and that is just one piece of GDPR. So basically the challenge is, how much money do you want to spend as a company on GDPR, comparing it to the business value that you actually get, compared to the customer benefits that you actually get, compared to how much risk is the business willing to take.
Thank you, Niels. Our next member speaking is Pernille.
Well, I don't think fines are enough. I think it's enough for highly regulated, law-abiding banks like you. You are really taking this very seriously, but I don't think it's enough for all these multinational big data companies who will find a way around regulation. I think we are all responsible for this in the future. We have the government or the states, we have individuals, and we have companies. We all have a part of responsibility for this. Governments have to have the good law, and they have to enforce the law, which we haven't done in Denmark at all. We haven't enforced the law. Government has to promote new products and services who are privacy by design, and government has to be a role model, which is very seldom we see that in Denmark. That's one part of the responsibility. Then we have individuals. We have to take a responsibility as well and start demanding products which are more privacy by design. I have a little folder here if anybody want that about digital self-defense. We should learn that and take care of our own data. And then we have companies, and I'm sure companies will see this. I'm sure that privacy is a new green. It is just starting now, and it will take years, of course, but we are seeing some companies around the world, in Europe especially, who are starting to use this as a competitive advantage. And I'm sure that will be a differentiator in the future. So companies will also have to take a responsibility, an ethical responsibility, producing products privacy by design, being data ethical or ethical in responsible with their data, and treat other people's data in the same way as they want their children's data to be treated. And I'm pretty sure we'll see that. We have some concrete examples in Denmark. Lego is one, but we have lots of smaller companies also, and around Europe, Germany, France, Belgium, Holland, where we see this new trend coming up.
Thank you, Pernille. Next one is Martin.
Yeah, thank you. Two initial comments. One relates to one relates to the use of data, especially personal data, with respect to this new technology, or not new technology, but new technology very much in focus, blockchain technology or distributed ledger technology, and the other is a more general comment on what we should do with respect to data or privacy protection. It's always fun when you are dealing with technology to see whenever there's a new paradigm coming up, how that will be adopted to existing ways of regulation of human activity. And I don't think I have to explain to you guys here what the blockchain is, but you might remember back in the old days when everybody was talking about commercial use of the internet in the middle of the 1995, something like that. Everybody thought that now we have this internet, and that means that everything is moving into a total other dimension, and it's going to be totally void, or there's not going to be any traditional legal regulation that's going to be applicable, because we're moving into this cyberspace. Some of you guys might remember John Perry Barlow's Cyberfest Manifesto, which was today pretty laughable, not in intention obviously, but the fact that he thought that this was going to be an area that is not going to be regulated by any traditional regulation. I mean, the fact is today that when we look around each other here and in this tent, there's obviously some regulation of our meat space activities, but there's much more regulation if we just move this onto cyberspace or online. Then it's totally regulated and surveyed in a way that we could not have imagined before. So when people think that privacy rules or privacy is not going to be applicable to blockchain technology, then it's either naive or it's a cyber libertarian's wet dream that's never going to be fulfilled, because this is going to be an area that is so regulated that you cannot dream about it. We just don't know how it is going to be regulated right now. But one area where I obviously think, where I actually think there is a problem by concept, that's privacy. Because when you think about what is at least the really the open blockchains, which are distributed ledger, distributed databases, where the whole idea is that there is no single centralized database that is controlled by one single person or one single entity, but it's a concept that involves that there are databases all over the place on all the nodes of a blockchain, of a particular setup of a blockchain, and nobody really controls that. That's the whole concept, that nobody can monopolize the decisions about what is the right state, what is the right database. And if you apply that to traditional regulation of data protection, which has concepts such as a data owner or controller and a data processor, that's per definition not applicable here. So if we talk about traditional blockchains, open blockchains like the Bitcoin network, but also if somebody wants to use an open blockchain where everybody can access and become nodes and all things are available to let's say bikes, registration of ownerships of bikes, where you have a personal identification of the ownership of a bike all over the world, then I would argue that cannot be done under European personal data protection rules, because you don't have a data controller, you don't have a data owner, you don't have a data processor. So that's totally impossible. And that's actually quite fun to say, because the traditional regulator will have to say, well, we don't know what to do. But most of the blockchains, and in particular blockchains within the public sector, are not going to be open blockchains. They're going to be permission-based or closed blockchains where you would have to sign some kind of an agreement in order to become a node on the network or get access to the database. And that agreement will have everything. Once people like me start to understand how we can make money on advising on these things, we will come up with a lot of agreements about these things that will incorporate traditional EU data protection rules with all the concepts into those foundational consortial agreements about that. And on top of that, and that's going to be real fun and interesting also, some of these things are going to be embedded in those smart contracts that will be part of the blockchain 2.0, the Ethereum-based blockchains, where you can actually have some of these aspects, some of the consent mechanisms actually embedded in the smart contract that will be part of these permission-based blockchains. So I think obviously this can be done, but with the really extraordinary, interesting, decentralized, open blockchains, forget about data protection. It's not going to happen unless they don't have any personal data on them. That's of course entirely doable, but if you want to use it for something like registration of land or bicycles or something like that, where it's tied to a physical person, then it's not going to in any way be compatible with these kind of laws. And I think I'll just leave it here, and then we can discuss more generally whether the GDPR is the right way to go forward, if we need more or maybe less.
Thank you, Martin. And now we hear from Irina.
Great, thanks. So I found the question itself really interesting because you're asking really whether the fines are enough to safeguard the individual's right to protection of personal data, which is an interesting formulation whether we use fines to safeguard rights. It's the law that's safeguarding the right. The fine is the teeth. The fine itself is an interesting animal. It's very large, so it's making a lot of people very, very nervous, and it's making large entities like banks try to figure out how to fix things. GDPR itself, I think, is a very interesting piece of legislation. It got lobbied almost to death, but it also produced some teeth. What's very interesting to me, and even though I'm an academic, I actually have a secret weapon, and that's called students that are doing their master's thesis and bachelor theses in companies and in the world, so I have a connection. Recent projects are showing that there are companies both in Denmark and outside of Denmark that are budgeting in the fine. And they're budgeting in the fine, and they're expecting to pay it, or hoping not to pay it, but budgeting it in, because they realize that the costs of implementing the changes necessary to be compliant with GDPR are astronomical. And because they're astronomical, they're basically saying it's cheaper to pay the fine for the next few years, and then we'll see where the actual lines are going to be drawn, while we figure out how to do this cheaper. Now the thing is, nobody actually knows who is going to be fined for what yet. Now, starting in about a year from now, we're going to have all kinds of interesting cases coming up. But right now, we don't know. And GDPR, while it does have these financial teeth, it's also a piece of legislation that has a lot of things that are going to have to be defined through case law. They're going to have to be defined through people figuring out what the hell does reasonable mean? How far does pseudonymous versus anonymous go? What does it mean, reasonable effort to make data anonymous in the event that de-anonymization may become possible later? Nobody knows that. It's a lovely piece of foresight on the part of the lawmakers, but it makes it very difficult to set expectations for what's actually going to happen. But it is making a lot of people nervous, which is lovely, because in terms of the state of our personal data, things are bad. Things are really bad. The expectation that you need to teach individual end users your mom, your grandma, to take care of their personal data is ludicrous. It's ridiculous. It's impossible. I probably would be right in guessing that while most of you here at Bornhack are extremely technically adept, how many of you have read an end-user license agreement last time you installed an app? Yeah, that's the typical answer. And I mean, honestly, we all know we ought to know better, right? Yeah, we all ought to know better, but really, how much time do we have? Now, 10 years ago, some friends of mine did a study, and they tried to figure out how much time it would take to read privacy policies on the 15 most popularly used websites. 300 hours a year. Really? That's just 15 most popular websites. That's if you want to keep up to date with their privacy changes per year. And we have a lot more now. So it's impossible. And also the conditions are impossible. So we asked, your app would like access to your contacts and your various other sensors to run. And you say, okay, do you want to give consent to this? Okay, maybe yes, maybe no. Really? Do you have enough information to make that judgment? No, you never do. What you're asked to do is to perform a vision of the future. Will that in some way eventually be difficult for you or make things difficult? How are these data going to be used? So in some ways, GDPR is attempting to mitigate some of that. The very idea that you can only collect data that you need for provision of service, and the need for provision of service isn't equal to, I need to sell it to finance my provision of service. That's actually key, that's important. The very idea that you don't need to ask consent for data that you need for the provision of service. But if you want to sell that data, you best ask for consent for it. So now as a consumer, I know you're asking for my consent to access my contacts. You definitely don't need that for the provision of service. You need it for something else. There's certain very interesting things in this law. I'm not sure the fines are it, but the fines are going to make people actually think about what they need to do. And that means they're going to make people think about ethics, which is going to be interesting.
Thank you. Thank you all for offering a broader picture, broader, clearer overview of the different aspects of GDPR and the points it touches. Now, we heard from a legal compliance point of view, embedding ethics, shared responsibility, difficulties of implementations and costs. Now, we'd like to invite you to open this debate, keeping the user in mind. Because in the end, all of us, regardless of our level of knowledge and skills, we're users of something. We are end users, right? And how exactly, or where does the user stand? Will GDPR change at least the user behavior online, or its relationship to technology at all? If yes, how? If no, why? Any thoughts? Yes, Martin.
I think it's a very good starting point to look at what will the effect be on the user. And I think I'm willing to make a bet that it's not going to make any effect at all, because this regulation is not made in reality to help the user. It's made for me as a lawyer, so I can make money on implement it, for people advising on it, so they can make money on giving advice, and on regulators to be able to say, yes, we delegated the answer to the responsible to you users, so you are responsible. We gave, I mean, you could just say no. And this has been a fundamental flaw in EU data protection rules from the beginning, that it's using this illusion of privacy based on consent. And I think I mean, you already pointed to it, that any rational person, I can say for myself, I'm a lawyer. I have never ever read a privacy statement unless somebody paid me to do it. Because because I'm intelligent. I'm a rational person because I know that the expected value of or the expected risk of dying or losing my house or something like that from actually having some kind of a less privacy or privacy violation compared to the opportunity cost of spending that amount of time that I could spend on something else, making money or seeing my kids, on reason these, just doesn't make it up. To some extent, we don't care, and we're not going to care in the future as well. Not that it's not important for us as a society to have privacy, but we as users don't care. There are people here who care because it's a professional interest, and it's part of being a hacker that you per definition should think that this is interesting. But for normal people, they don't care. I've been at numerous different committees over the years where telcos and others said, well, okay, we'll make a privacy compliant solution with email, so nobody can see anything. It's going to cost 10 kroners every month more for the users. Nobody is going to use it because not even for 10 kroners a month do they care for their privacy. So if we want to do something for users, don't delegate the responsibility to them. Come up with a different solution. And I think fundamentally, to have this kind of privacy that is based on actually consent is the biggest illusion you can give of privacy at all. You should realize that data is going to flow, and we should enable data to flow, but make rules about how they are, how people are allowed to use them. Make rules about transparency of what data do you actually hold. Make other rules about transparency of algorithms and things like that. But having these silly rules that are wonderful for me as a lawyer and wonderful for regulators, that's simply flawed.
Thank you.
Well, you're probably right that the masses won't care for a long time. Just as if you go back 45, 50 years, the masses, most people didn't care about the environment either. But then you started to see a growing consciousness. And that's what we'll see within privacy. We'll see the rich and the wealthy and the famous demand products and services where they can just pay their way out of this. Because I agree they're too lazy to do what I'm doing, for example, or teaching kids to do. So you're right, it will be a minority in the beginning, but I'm pretty sure that we'll see a rise of privacy tech coming up in the same way, because it's so fundamentally important for us to control our own lives. And I also think that the GDPR will make a movement of conscious consumers who will start, like Max Schrems out of Austria, asking the companies, what do you have of data about me? And I'm sure a lot of us will, some of us will make, standard letters you can send to companies and the government and ask what data you have. So there will be a consciousness rising. It takes a long time, but we will see it slowly coming up.
Thank you. Yes.
Just one. I think probably yes. I've been hearing this rise of consciousness for 20 years. I haven't seen it, but it might be coming. But that doesn't mean that there's not a need for better protection. I just doubt that it will be based on consciousness. And I think we must agree, at least, that if this is going to happen, it's not going to happen on the basis of those kind of rules that we have now, because the rich and famous, they don't need other rules because they are the ones that will always use these rules. You can see in all the most dictatorial states in the world, they have they're building their privacy rules on the basis of our rules in the EU, because they know that they can use these rules to have small companies, dissidents, to say, well, you're not supposed to say that I've been at this place paying money to this person, because that's violating my privacy rules. But they don't give a fuck about the other way around. So we should simply reinvent this. It's totally flawed, and it's being misused all the time. The only people who are making money out of it are lawyers, the lawyers that are employed by Google, and all the regulators who have all the commissions and having all these kind of things to sort of because they know how to do it.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, I get your point, and I think you're right to like 70-80% of it. But I also think that there are some elements of the GDPR that are pretty easy, understandable for the majority of people, and I think they will be tested. At least that's what we expect. If we talk about the right to insight, the right to portability, the right to be forgotten, those things that I see with or I think with the increased information about GDPR coming up next year, I guess, there will be many people trying this out. And you could say, there was one thing I was thinking about, those companies just choosing that option to put aside money. That makes GDPR quite unfair, doesn't it? Because not all companies have that option. I mean, if you're a hospital or an insurance company, you couldn't just say, okay, we'll take the fine.
Well, yeah, talking about fairness, it isn't fair. Nothing's fair in this world. So, but I just want to respond to 2 points here. On the one hand, Martin, that's just downright quotable. I'm never going to read a privacy policy unless I'm paid for it. May I quote you on this?
Of course. I mean,
I think it's brilliant. Somebody please tweet this. It's awesome. But you're right. Consent it's a fundamentally flawed concept. It comes from a deeply positive idea of informational self-determination, the idea that all of us are thinking human beings that can make our own decisions for ourselves, but it results in a shift in responsibility to the consumer to protect themselves, to make these decisions, and making it impossible. And I also want to comment on the idea of environmental consciousness, in the sense that the idea that it is our own responsibility as individuals to be environmentally conscious is very nice, and it works for the middle class and above. It is not exactly accessible to people that are that don't have the finances or the ability to do that. So in that sense, certainly privacy can become a purview of the rich. It already is. But the fact also is that individual consciousness about environment doesn't actually do a whole lot for the environment itself. It makes us feel better, but it doesn't actually make a huge amount of difference. So if we're going to go this route about privacy, we can make ourselves feel better, but it won't make that much difference. So, sure, okay.
Well, we need a demand, right? So with the whole green movement, there's been a demand now. So you're producing more and more organic food and more solar panels because there's a demand among consumers.
Sure, but a lot of that organic food isn't that great for the environment. But the demand, so there's a trade-off and sometimes an ethical issue with a lot of the environmental movements in the same way. So there's always a question. And the question is, in many ways, what kind of world do we want to live in? I think part of the reason why we have the Project Virtue, and that started this year finally, is that we think that it's important to think about what kind of world we want to live in. There's a moment right now where I think a lot of us, both those that are developing technologies and those that are working for big multinationals and those that are researching this stuff and those that haven't really thought about this much before, suddenly realizing that the world's gotten a little bit creepy and a little bit scary, and perhaps we're not going in the direction where we want. People are writing manifestos about ethics and IoT and ethics and technology. Design Tech Fest coming up next week is going to be about responsible technologies and responsibility. These kinds of words weren't around a few years ago. We weren't even thinking about this. So something is going on. We are uncomfortable with this. But really, what does ethical technology mean? What does it mean to be ethical? What does it mean to design ethical technology? How the hell do you do it? What does privacy mean in every day? I frankly think privacy is the wrong question. Because for a regular consumer, privacy is a meaningless concept. How's your privacy doing today? Is it doing okay? What about yours? Your privacy okay? Feeling a little bruised maybe? In the everyday, privacy is a useless concept. What's privacy? So when we're talking about it, we better talk about what is it that we're talking about it. About privacy is just obscuring things.
Yes. Martin?
But I think, I mean, an overall question is, of course, to what extent is privacy necessary, and that is a totally different. It's a related discussion, but much broader, because the whole concept of I mean, everybody knows that the reason why we are sitting in a tent here and not in the caves is because we've been able to exchange information in a more rapid sense since the dawn of the primordial soup. And suddenly we have, I mean, I work with open source, and the only reason why the open source is such a great thing is because you are allowed to exchange information. But the only thing you're not allowed to exchange information about, unless you get sort of like through a censorship, you have to have a yes before.
Yes.
That's personal data. And that might be, so yes, I accept that that's a good idea to a certain extent, but in a lot of situations you should be allowed to exchange personal information about dictators and rich and famous people that are cheating and things like that. So I don't think it's necessary like this, that you should have privacy all the time as sort of like a it's not that Moses came down from the mountain and say, oh, I forgot the 11th commandment, thou shalt have privacy. It's really a problematic concept, in my opinion. I just want to make one comment to what you said.
Actually, I heard that he did, but it
But
it just wasn't documented.
No, you weren't allowed to say it because you had privacy. He didn't give you permission. But and that was even before open source. No, but I just want to make one comment to what you said about the GDPR. I think there's a lot of good things there as well. I'm just objecting to the core tenet of the regulation, also the GDPR, which is consent. And one thing that is really interesting about the GDPR is data portability, because in honesty, I think that the most important regulation going forward is how to actually enable some competition with respect to data. And if we had real competition with respect to data, and data about data, and data about data about data, if we have really competition about that, that I could take my personal information from some place to another place, that would probably protect my privacy much more than the fact that I would have to give consent before somebody did something to me.
Tessa, you wanted to say something?
In my opinion, privacy is a fundamental right. And being a fundamental right, privacy is fundamental for democracy. That's why privacy is so important. And the concept of privacy might be very abstract to some, because there's the physical privacy, the privacy that I have a private sphere where I don't want other people to enter without my consent. And I have a privacy sphere digitally in my computer where I don't want people to look at my pictures, or in my messages where I don't want Google to scan my emails. Privacy is a fundamental right, and it is fundamental for democracy, and it is about time that we start to realize this and that we start to work about creating a long-term awareness among the users, in my opinion.
Yes. As you also mentioned earlier, it is a fundamental right, but it is also very difficult to define the concept itself. And there are different types of privacy. Each of us have a subjective definition of it. It is contextual. How do we develop solutions that let the user actually make a decision, decide what they want to share, when, to whom, without putting too much responsibility on the user?
Well, privacy is the right to decide who knows what about me when. And it's about giving you not ownership, which it's a strong, wrong word, but control over your own life. And I'm going to Tallinn and Helsinki next week for My Data conference, which is really interesting because it's a lot of companies and governments actually trying to change the whole infrastructure where you as an individual is in control of your own data, or you decide who should be in control of your own data, and then you can use your data and give away your data and enhance competition and all this stuff. So we are also in a time where we all need to learn to use our data much more, and to understand that our data can be really, really good for us, and we can use it in many, many ways.
Yeah. Martin and Tessa.
Well, I beg to differ. I don't think. I think it's even more fundamental right in a democracy, the right to share information. And I think if I have to choose between the two, I rather prefer a society, and I think it would be more amenable to growth, progress, error corrections, and all these things that have taken us out of the cave. That I didn't have to ask anybody for the right to say no. This information, can I use this or can I use this? I mean, and it's obviously that it's in no way going to hold water to say privacy is the right to decide what information about you should be shared or not. I mean, because that's taking that to the extreme is ridiculous. I mean, you wouldn't argue that if I go out, go back to my wife and tell I met Pernille today. No, you have to ask me about this before you can do it, because that is ultimate what this would mean. And I think what we have to do is to come up with a solution that's based on what I think is always a good idea. I know that from software development that the default is open, and then you have different ways to say, well, there is actually some situations where transparency and openness is not working out. So you learn to mitigate that either by protecting yourself, because you can actually, to a certain extent, like with copyright, you can protect all your knowledge by just keeping it in your head to those things you don't want to share. You could also say that there's, just as we discussed with in the old days when we decided to go from censorship to not censorship, to say, well, actually, everybody can say everything on. They don't have to ask for permission before, just like sharing personal data. But there are certain things that you cannot do where you have to be responsible for what you're doing afterwards. But the default is open. Yes. It's not that you can decide whether this is going to be shared or not, but you can say, well, there are certain things that you cannot use it for, and I'm going to get you with legislation afterwards if you do. If you're using it in a way that we as society has said that's not going to be the case.
Yes, it's Tessa first, and then Jens.
Yeah, well, concerning the Estonian model, the interesting thing, as you said, is that the user or the data subject is in control of their own data. They decide which institution should have access to which data and on what grounds. Actually, in Estonia, if you have a picture of your car and scans your license plate, you can go home and on your own computer and look up that the authorities has had access to your data, and you can see you haven't done anything, and you will have the ability to file a case against the police, for example, for accessing your data without any legal grounds. And that is a very interesting model, but I don't think in the current situation in Denmark, this is not what is going to happen. But we need to create more long-term awareness, and we could do that if data protection becomes a marketing asset for companies. It can create long-term awareness not only among companies, but also among the users.
Thank you. Niels?
Yeah, that was just a comment to your discussion. I think it can quickly become very theoretically and discussing about what is data privacy and what do we mean, and probably you're both right looking from your own side of the arguments. But taking it back to GDPR, I guess we could agree that there are some healthy principles in GDPR. I mean, things like a company being able to explain to the user, what are you using my data for? I think that's also a healthy exercise for any company to actually go through that exercise, defining what are we using this for.
A short one to Martin. Just want to say, I think that if we give users control of their own data, we will see much, much more sharing. It's not a question of either or. If I trust anybody, I will give my data. If I trust the bank, I'll give many more data to the bank, and I'll share more. So I'm not afraid of. It's not a question of either regulation or sharing.
Thank you. Irina?
Well, in terms of users sharing more, we have a really nice example of that, or lack thereof, which is the British effort for care data. And if you guys are unfamiliar with this, a few years ago, the British government decided to centralize and collect all of the National Health Service data. And one of the things that they were forced to do was they were forced to allow people to withdraw their data. And given the number of people that did, it rendered that data set unusable. There was a lot of other problems with care data. There's not been papers written about it, lots of discussions about what happened, why it failed. It was presented badly, it wasn't explained well, et cetera, et cetera. But it was a nice example of when, in this particular climate, with the lack of trust in the institutions, with the trust in government institutions failing across the world and going down, those kinds of expectations that if we are given control of our data, we'll share more, may not bear out. However, the Estonian case is interesting because it produced immediately enormous amount of decision fatigue. Seriously, just imagine having to make decisions about every single piece of your data and who you're going to share it with. Just for a moment, take like a second and think about how many decisions you're going to have to make. And then think about how you're going to deal with it. Probably, mostly, not dealing with it. Because the cognitive load of having to make this many decisions is just going to be huge. And you're trying to feed your kids. Who has the time? It's crazy. Not to mention the fact that the very idea of personal data, what's my data, is a really difficult concept when you're talking about individuals, because what's my data? Data are, by and large, socially produced. They're produced with people. We're producing data right now, together. Who owns this?
I own my share.
It's getting tweeted. Who owns that? But we're also producing data when we interact with each other. We're producing data that is also embedded within institutions and institutional arrangements that have particular ideas about what these data are. There's a social contract and there's the inherent political contract with the CPR number. There's a social contract and there's a citizenship contract with the government with the kind of data that they collect. We have expectations about how these data are treated. None of that fits within personal data.
Thank you. Yes, Martin.
Just a follow up on that. Actually, I think it's very much in the same vein. I mean, your baseline is that, or your tagline is that we should give users more control. They have control today. The whole GDPR is based on control, and the point here is that this control is something that you could argue whether people care about it, but by the end of the day, a lot of people are willing to trade that control for things that they don't know really about what's the value of giving up that control or not. So the point is here, and I think the biggest problem is here, that everybody involved in this is so biased towards what is the standard approach.
Are you saying that people today consciously, all of us who gave up our privacy to Facebook, for example, did we do that totally conscious that we're paying with all our data? Do you believe that?
We did it consciously in the sense that we knew by pressing this that this would have some kind of consequences.
We knew that Facebook microphone is recording in the room and stuff like that. We knew all that.
Yeah, but the thing is also, I would also argue that the minute we've seen a lot of these examples that suddenly it came out that Facebook did this, or suddenly Instagram did that, or so on. And what happened was that we could have expected that, okay, now social media use would decrease. Maybe people would not stop using Facebook, but it would decrease. No, it just continued up. I think that it's the only way to solve this is to give up the fallacy of believing that in user control in this area. You have to say, like in many other areas, you have to say, well, people, if we want to regulate this, we should figure out from in a democratic society, what can you use data for, what can you not use data for, and then we should allow that all these data are exchanged, but it cannot be used for this and this and this. Because also the other way, I mean, one thing is that it's an illusion for users. The other thing is that, I mean, whenever, I can't remember who said it here, but it's totally correct, that whenever there is some kind of a new regulation like the GDPR, it just means that Google are hiring 1,000 more lawyers. So they can always find a way out of this. But the startups that I'm working with, they cannot. So this is just another example. Not that I'm saying that Google is doing something that they're not allowed to do, but this kind of regulation where you have to spend a lot of time on compliance is actually just a barrier to innovation. And that means that all the small innovative use and also maybe uses that could be extremely beneficial for society is not happening, because it's only the big guys who can actually afford to comply.
Tessa, you wanted to intervene?
Yeah, well, I just want to ask the question whether or not consent is voluntarily, if social media has become such an integrated part of our daily lives. You can't just choose not to be on Facebook if you're in a school, public school. You have to be in a Facebook group to see when your classmates are meeting to do your homework or whatever. It can be at your job. A lot of different job types uses social media, you know, to interact with each other, to change shift with each other. Facebook, Instagram, and other LinkedIn and other social medias are just an integrated part of our lives now. So we don't have the freedom to make a free consent anymore. You know, it's not a free choice. You just have to use these platforms if you want to be in.
You are totally right, and that's why I cannot understand why you're still basing your argument about regulation that there's supposed to be consent when it's not. It's the portability of the data that matters. It's not the consent. So I don't understand why we're sitting always, because I mean, if your base argument is that you should give consent, and you think that it's not voluntary anyway, because people are saying yes anyway, why base all regulation on it? Why just to not say, well, what the hell, this is happening. Let's concentrate on regulating more what the Facebook are using the data for.
It's going very well regulating Facebook, right?
Yeah, but that's because that's because everybody is focused on, okay, as long as they upgrade their privacy statements and you get the right, then it's fine. Forget about that. They could use it for whatever, they could collect as much as they want, as long as we focus on data portability. There are certain things they cannot use, and then we should fire all those people who have been working with coming up with these rules and hiring a totally new approach of getting a real some public authorities, some agencies who could look into what is actually used. Start talking about devolving, disclosing algorithms and things like that. But leave that consensus thing and just realize that it's good for society that data flows.
Yes. Irina?
Consent is a problematic construct. And it's fundamentally the way it has been used has created enormous amounts of problems. There are right now efforts at other kinds of approaches. So the city of Barcelona, along with a number of other partners, are testing what they're calling a data commons. It's a way to try and achieve a sort of distributed responsibility about data. How do you stop forcing risk onto individuals? How do you distribute that risk? How do you share in both the decisions about data, but also in the responsibility for making decisions about it, and in the weight of figuring out what's right and wrong? And how do you share that in your interfacing with other companies? Whether the data commons is going to be a successful or unsuccessful test, it's an attempt to try and figure out a different sort of approach. GDPR is fundamentally an individual, focused on individuals. Law typically tends to focus on individuals. After all, how else is it going to work? The biggest loophole in GDPR is the fact that, in the end, the kinds of things we're trying to protect ourselves from, the kinds of social sorting and discrimination that we are worried about, can happen completely without having the entities that discriminate knowing about who we are. Because in the end, if you are the kind of person that goes to Bornhack, and you're part of a group of people that go to Bornhack, and you're identified as such, not as an individual, not with your name and being tied to an individual physical person, but the type of individual that goes to Bornhack, and then that kind of individual now is treated differently by different entities and potentially social institutions, we have a problem. But GDPR isn't going to fix that. So there are many issues here. Consent is one. I think throwing out consent completely is never going to happen, but mitigating it and dealing with it and acknowledging that it is not a solution is really important. Acknowledging the data, then an individual control of data is perhaps not a complete solution either. That individual control of data is also too much is another thing that needs to happen. But I think GDPR is forcing these conversations. And the fact that we're having this conversation right now is really important. So in and of itself, that is a good change.
Well, I'm not going to argue in favor of consent, but I'm not a lawyer, but I understand that this is the only tool we have today. We don't have the alternative. So that's a very good idea to start inventing an alternative. I agree on that. But saying that GDPR is a hindrance to innovation is not true, I think, because what it's trying to is saying, well, let's start doing some inventions or innovative solutions with privacy by design, for example. And that's what we'll probably see more of in Europe, that we'll try and make new services, which is not like Facebook and Google and all these tools where they have control over data. Now we should make some tools where you, if you want to, have control over data, or where humans are in the center. So I don't think it's a hindrance of innovation.
Yes.
I'll just say, I think that's a good thing as well. I think that what could probably happen, which to a certain extent would solve the competition problem, which I think is the biggest problem here for privacy, is that we don't start to invent solutions where you as the user are in control, but where nobody is in control. So there's real competition, but that means also that everybody can use something without asking permission first. And that's that. Then we're back to the open blockchain, obviously. Yeah. But this is the shift, because I'm arguing for a big data pool, also a personal data that can be used for everybody, also for those who want to use it to hold somebody accountable, because this is how a democratic society is run. And the more that is available, the more innovation, the more people in a basement somewhere can just tap into it and find new ways to using it. There just has to be some very, very strong discussions and rules about what you use it for. Can I just make one example? I mean, if you go into a job interview, you don't take over a hijab or something, or a bag over your head or something. They can actually see that you're a woman, how old you are, and they can hear your voice, and they can probably see whether you have some kind of a physical sickness or something like that. And you don't insist that, no, you have to I have to give you permission to have that interview, so you know that I have this and this and this. You might say, yeah, we should have a rule about that, but you would give permission anyway, because otherwise you couldn't get to that interview. So it's an illusion. But we have rules saying, yes, this information flows freely, but you cannot use it to discriminate on these and these and these things. And this is the approach we should take to personal data that's flowing online as well.
I agree. I think that it seems that, in my perspective, that you're advocating for is a kind of anarchist way of dealing with data. Open, free market, everyone does what they can, open by default. But I think that, or I don't know, I'm wondering whether this sort of anarchy is the outcome, or like the way towards enlightenment, or the outcome of an enlightenment population, of enlightened users. Irina, and then Martin.
So something interesting happens when you advocate for open data and you lead with anyone can use it, because not anyone can use it. That's never going to happen, because in order to be able to use data, you have to have a lot of specialist training and a lot of education, access to all of that, access to the kinds of technology that would allow you to use this usefully. So clearly that's already immediately a creation of a particular kind of elite. Now, the open data, let's make it open and we'll have lots of great innovation. That experiment has already been ongoing for a while, and that's the open city data, that's the open data experiments that a lot of cities have done. What they found was that either nobody really used the data, or the data was then used to great advantage by multinationals with lots of resources to use the data, and very few others who were able to actually use it productively, and a few very interesting and great startups and smart people that got together and did some great innovation. But by and large, right now, open city data is benefiting multinationals significantly.
Yes, very short, Martin, and then we wrap up.
I mean, the argument about that you shouldn't, there's a problem with openness because not everybody can use openness, that's fundamentally flawed, I think. First of all, the argument that then it should be closed if not everybody can use it, which is not exactly what you're saying, but close to. That is flawed first because it's not going to be closed. The elites are going to have access to that data. It's just the good guys. I'm pointing to myself. It's just the good guys who are not going to get access to it. It's the same thing with the you might remember the discussion of cryptography about a prohibition about on the right to encrypt things 20 years ago. The argument was that we are not going to do we should not allow that. But the fact was that this meant that me and other people who are totally law-abiding would not be allowed to encrypt, but all the bad guys would do it anyway. And this is the same thing. If you just say, well, we are going to because there's some, it's only going to be elite who can actually use it. This not going to work. And honestly, I think one of the best examples, because people like this, I mean, a bunch of hackers. I just went by Prosa's store where it says "Stop Acta." It was a little bit old, but the fact is that one of the reasons why these guys could help me with my democratic rights that I was not able to figure out because I didn't have a clue about what was going on was because there was somebody who, from the bottom up, got access to a lot of data that they couldn't get access before. And I think this is exactly also the reason why I want personal data to flow more freely. Obviously, a lot of dictators and bad guys are going to use it, but they were going to get access to it anyway.
Thank you.
Okay, wait a minute. What if we invert it? Give me a sec. What if we invert it? What if you do something where multinationals have to pay, but the little guys can get it? I don't know. Think of new structures.
Thank you all. This was very exciting. Let's see if the audience has some questions to address to you. And one single bit is that maybe you can address the question to one member or two maximum, and then we have more chances to get more questions from the audience. Okay. Yes. Yes. I'll just repeat the question. The question is for Martin, advocating for openness of data, whether he would publish his web browser history and mail and the rest. I got it? Okay.
Well, if you heard me saying that people should be forced to open their data, then obviously I've said something wrong, because I could never argue that you should be forced. I mean, it may be some public information like tax returns or something like that would be a good idea, but obviously you should not be forced. What I'm saying in this case like this, I can protect myself by going incognito or using Tor or something like that, or I can use encryption. And this is the way that I think that I should try to protect myself here, because if it, but if the protection is not going to come because there is some legislation saying that it's not going to flow freely unless I give permission, because my browser history to a large extent is known by everybody who has an interest in it anyway. It's just the no, you don't. You do, because you could, and this is another flaw, that you think probably that a lot of people have an interest in your browser history, but I don't think so.
No, I mean, like, I'm personally interested in what you're reading. I'm sure it's interesting stuff.
Yeah, but obviously I'm sharing on Goodreads and all these kind of things what I'm reading. Oh, you mean you mean in general?
Yeah.
But, and you have that interest in 1,000 people, or it's just me?
Well, I mean, right now it's mostly you.
Okay. Yeah, because I think, I mean, to a large extent, a lot of this discussion is also based on that a lot of people think that they're interesting, and I don't think I'm especially interesting.
Well, I think the companies that are collecting your browsing history think you're interesting in an aggregate sense of like they're collecting lots of people's browsing history, and altogether it's what's quite interesting. And those companies are doing interesting things with that data, and it's not generally available. There's, like Twitter and Facebook have their little buttons all over the web, so they see a good portion of what you're browsing. And I guess if I understood you correctly, you're suggesting that data should flow freely because those companies are collecting it, and you've consented. I really like what you were saying about consent being very misleading, and it's not really, people aren't really consenting. I agree with you there. But
I think, I mean, let's get this clear. I'm not advocating that people should be forced to release personal data, unless, I mean, there might be certain situations, but in generally, no. I'm advocating saying that if we want to protect privacy, if we want to protect personal data, it's not going to happen through consent. It's because my browser history is to a large extent known by Google, and because I synchronize it on all the devices and things like that, and they probably know it anyway, because I've probably said yes to it somewhere, because I didn't feel that it was, I didn't spend time reading the privacy statement, so they know it anyway. What I would say is that it would be much better to realize that this is happening, and they should be able to use it. At least a smaller company could also use it for something innovative, but there should be more strict rules about, regardless of whether what I said yes to, they could not use it for this, and it should be more transparent what they have and and how they're using it. That's where we should. It should be freely to flow more freely around, but it should be much more strict. The insight, the transparency, not just in my life, but also what they're using it for. And we should spend much more time on trying to develop rights and enforcement there, and not just in some silly idea about that, yeah, you said yes, so you should bear the consequences.
I'm sorry, I'm still not understanding actually if you are saying that the browsing history Google has collected should or should not be available to other companies who want to be able to do interesting analysis of it. Google's collected the data. You consented, whatever that consent means. Of course, didn't read the thing, and like most people have. But like, do you think that Google should be compelled to share that? I mean, they do let you export it. What should be different there in the way Google's collected all your browsing history and only they have it right now?
I think that what I'm saying is that whether I say yes or no to a privacy statement is of little consequence here. What is important here is to know what they collected by me, and what they are doing with it, and that's where we should actually have rules about how it could be used. And if they decide to share it with somebody else, then I should know about it, and I should be able to also hold that other company accountable for what they have about me and how they can use it.
Thank you. Well, take another question here.
Hello. I have a comment to something again Martin said about job interviews. You go to the job interview and they can see you. And funny thing, in Denmark, the biggest employer is the government, and any government job is being posted by a company called HR Talent Solutions, and they keep all of your job applications. I'm seeking employment at the moment. And every time I apply for one, they can see all the other jobs I've applied for within the government, the biggest employer in Denmark. They can read not just my applications and my CV to compare the CVs I sent because they're specialized for the job. They can also see why they chose not to hire me at that place, because it's one system. But my question is actually for Niels. We heard about the government, especially in Denmark, being the most horrendous in safeguarding privacy, and maybe them being a role model. Is this something that you, as a private company, are lacking or sort of missing? Could you point to the government and say, "Yeah, but you're not doing anything about it anyway"?
I don't know quite what to answer. I know that with respect to GDPR, there's a discussion going on at the moment if things like the government or any public authorities should actually be regulated by GDPR, or authorities should be able to fine themselves, so to speak. My opinion is that yes, of course, we should require the same things for public organizations as for private organizations. I don't know if it answers your question, but that's my viewpoint.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions in the audience? Yes.
Hello, I'm a security guy, and I know that the return on investment and making good security costs a lot of money, and it only gets better when it hurts. So, with all the astronomical amounts of money that you would need in an existing company, would that be the same for a new company that needs to be established? So, if I was going to start a bank, would it be harder for me after this, or was it?
I definitely think, and you always think that other people have it easier than you have it yourself, okay? But seen from my very objective, neutral position, I would say that if you are at least to the point of privacy by design, I think it's easier to implement that into a new design than to incorporate it into an existing design. Definitely. So new companies, because then you know the requirements when you build it, and then it's easier to incorporate instead of changing something that would build on maybe fundamentally opposite requirements.
Thank you.
I think Pernilla has a comment also.
Well, I just want to say to the transparency part, because you are arguing that instead of consent, we should have demand transparency and we should regulate that. And I'm just saying I don't think any of those really works, because transparency is also kind of naive to believe that those big multinational companies will be totally open about their algorithms. That's their recipe, like Coca-Cola. They're not going to be totally transparent about it. And regulation today is so hard because technology is so fast that we need also companies to take ethical stands, and we need individuals to take a responsibility. And of course we need regulation, but is it better to demand transparency than demanding consent in a world where both is actually quite unrealistic?
Thank you. Now we actually, if we don't have any more questions, we actually have 8 more minutes left. So we can take the chance to have 1.5 minutes. Oh, is that a question? That's two questions. Okay, so we don't take any. Okay, which one was you was first? Kamsi? Okay.
It's for Nils again. With all this GDPR, you cannot outsource responsibility, of course, and you will get the fine no matter who does the work or hasn't done the work. Do you think it will be efficient to outsource a lot of the GDPR work, because we have a lot of small companies in Denmark that might not have the money to hire guys like you? So would it be feasible to outsource some of it or all of it, or we shouldn't outsource any of it?
I think as a general question to that, or general answer to that question, I think you need to be in control of GDPR yourself within the company. I think it would be it could be quite risky to outsource it, would be my opinion.
Maybe just one comment to that. I mean, obviously there are some areas, to the extent that you are a small company and you are dealing primarily with your business model is based on handling personal data, then you will have to hire a DPO, a data protection officer, and I think to some extent that function has to be outsourced, because if you are two guys in a startup, you cannot just hire one person, or you cannot have one of those persons being totally, fulfilling these roles. So again, good roles for lawyers. We're going to make, as we're doing already in the existing regulation, we're going to make tons of money together with the security industry. It's another question whether it's actually benefiting users or society, but and you could probably also see some of the people who've been lobbying most for this are lawyers or lawyers who are hired by security firms.
Just one comment on the DPO. It might be interesting for you. The DPO function will be internal in Danske Bank. We hire our own people. It's going out of the group compliance office that we're establishing a separate entity.
But that also makes sense, because you have such a big. I mean, you wouldn't. You also have a big internal compliance department already. So
getting bigger and bigger.
That makes sense. But I think following up also on your question, the previous question about the barriers to entry, I think that everybody would agree that you can see that when you as a technology company or any company, bank or financial company, if you are at a certain level, then you start to actually embrace more regulation, because you know that regulation will actually prevent smaller companies to actually compete. It's obvious that this is an area where this is happening as well. The financial sector is filled with this kind of regulation, whether it's KYC or anti-money laundering things, or just solidity rules or things like that. But this is an obvious area where you can see that startups, if they are going to comply to start with, they rather say no, we're not going to do it. Don't quote me for this. I know a lawyer who has been saying that. If she talks to a lawyer, to a startup, and they ask about this, then her advice would be, figure out whether you morally think that you can that what you're doing with this personal data is okay, but don't start complying with these rules unless you have vast profit or big investors, because if you start complying from the beginning, then you're not going to start.
It's very true within the financial industry. There's this story in Denmark about Carsten Reh, also the billionaire, trying to go into Amagerbanken, losing 800 million kroners on it, and all his friends advised him not to do so, because the financial business is so regulated that it's very, very difficult to go in as a newcomer.
Thank you. I don't think we can take the last question. I'm sorry for that. So we will end this. Thank you all for coming, panel members, and thank you, audience, for coming as well. Also, European Digital Rights, they were very nice and supported us to make this happen. Also, we have some stickers that you can also get your hands on. And let's go out in the sun and have a sausage and a beer. Thank you.